Hi everyone. Now, I'm hoping this is actually going to work. It's a slightly new setup, so we shall see if this is working. Now, if you can hear me, if you can just give me a little kind of comment in the chat window so I know that the microphone and everything is actually working, that will be a great start. What we're going to be doing tonight then is basically just spending about 30 minutes to about 45 minutes just running through the topics in B4, because obviously you've got your B4 assessment tomorrow. So the idea of tonight is just to let you know, obviously, the key bits. We're not going to be reteaching the entire unit because we don't have that long. Okay? Right, let's see what we can get through then. So, the first thing that we are going to start off with in B4, which was the one all about the different ecosystems, cycles and all of this side of things, were some really important bits of key terminology. Because one of the key things we got to know before we can actually attempt a question is to actually know what they're talking about when they use certain scientific terms. So the first one that we've got is something called an ecosystem. So wherever you see the phrase ecosystem, this is referring to all of the living organisms and physical conditions in any given area. Second one, the community. These are all of the organisms within the ecosystem. The habitat is the area in which those organisms live. And then we come on to some terms which we associate mainly with the food chains and the food webs. So hopefully a nice recap on the work you've done back in Key Stage 3, if not Key Stage 2. So the first one is the producer. Whenever we talk about a producer, we are talking about an organism that makes its own food by photosynthesis. So this would be any plant or algae in the list at all. The next phrase we use is consumer, and we split the consumers up into different groups. So we've got the primary consumers, the secondary consumers, the tertiary consumers, and so on. A consumer, quite simply, is an organism that does not make its own food. So they have to eat another organism in order to gain their energy. So one of the key things we need to be able to do is understand the difference between a primary consumer and a secondary consumer. Primary consumers are the ones that eat the producers. So in your food chain or your food web, whatever organism is feeding off of those plants, they are your primary consumers. Then your secondary consumers feed off the primary consumers. So again, you can just pick that out from any food chain or food web. The last key term I'm going to introduce to you at this point is a decomposer, and quite simply, these are organisms that will gain energy by feeding on any dead or decaying matter. So that's our introduction to our key terms first of all. Now, food chains is our first little bit. I'm not going to spend too long drawing out food chains for you because hopefully we are quite good at that. Now, what we actually find is that in our food chain, I've got a food web instead to show you. So this is a food web. What we've got are obviously a range of different chains. So we're going to start down here with the grass, and we can follow it through to, I'm trying this backwards, the snail, and then we can come up to the squirrel there. So that would be one chain. So what we've actually got, those arrows that we can see, are actually showing the direction that the energy is flowing in. So the arrow pretty much means this is where the energy goes. So when we're actually writing out our food chains, make sure you get it facing the right way. If you've got the arrow pointing from the slug to the grass, to all intents and purposes, you're saying that the grass is going to eat the slug. This does not happen, folks. You do not see like hordes of grass just jumping out and then devouring a creature at some point. The energy doesn't go that way. It must go grass to the slug, to the frog, etc. Now, the origin of all energy in a food chain is the sun. Okay, so whenever we're looking at the ultimate source of all of that energy is the sun. That energy is then taken in by plants, and they use it in the process of photosynthesis. So the sunlight is absorbed by the chlorophyll, which we find inside chloroplasts. They use that photosynthesis to then make the glucose. That glucose is then going to be changed into the structural components of our plant, so carbohydrates and proteins, and it makes up the biomass. So photosynthesis makes the plant biomass. From that, when an animal eats the plant, then we transfer that biomass from the plant to the animal. So that means we've got that flow of biomass, or the flow of energy, through our food chain. One thing we should note though is not all of the energy that starts in our plant is going to make it into the next organism. Some of it is lost, and we'll have a look at the different reasons for that a little bit later on in our review today. One of the words that we have mentioned there is biomass. Now, biomass, quite simply, is just the amount of living material present. So if we were to dry out an organism, the biomass would be what is left. Now, what we actually find is that when we're looking at biomass transfer, really we're looking at food chains and food webs. And we can split those food webs up into these things called trophic levels, or feeding levels. So whenever we use the phrase trophic level, what we're referring to is a feeding level that shows where those organisms sit within that food chain or food web. So on this one, here we go, let's try and get the pointing in place again. There we go. So if we're starting down at the bottom here, we've got our grass. So that is our producer. That is one trophic level. As we then come up, we can see our primary consumers here, because we've got a snail and a slug, both of which are feeding on the producer. So that's our next trophic level. And then we can move up to the next trophic level here, which has got our squirrel, the hedgehog, and also the frog in it. So those are our secondary consumers. They're feeding off the primary consumers. And then we go all the way up to the top. You can see the heron on the other side there. That would be a tertiary consumer, because it's feeding off the secondary consumer level. If they ask you a question to write down the name or identify or name any of those consumers, just find the right level and then pick a name. If it says just name A or name 1, just write down 1. Don't go writing down everything, because one silly error and it's wrong, okay? So just write down the number that they ask you to. So that should cover that first little bit for us. Obviously, if you do have questions as we go through this, the chat window is there. Feel free to ask and I will answer as we go. The next part we looked at were different factors that can affect what lives in an area. So we had the biotic and the abiotic factors. Biotic are living factors. Break the word down. Bio is all about living things, okay? So biotic factors are the living factors. And the good examples here are number of organisms and what the organisms are actually competing for. If we talk about an abiotic factor, this is a non-living or a physical factor. Things like the temperature or the pH of the environment, the amount of rainfall, okay? Anything like that is abiotic, it's not living. One of the things that they could ask you to do with regards to this is actually talk about these factors, particularly the abiotic ones, and suggest an experiment we could do to investigate it and its effects. So what we need to do is, first of all, understand how those abiotic factors affect things like plant growth and animal survival, and secondly, how we can measure it. So the first one that we really need to concern ourselves with is light. Now, light, as we hopefully do remember, is needed for photosynthesis. So what we find is the availability of light will affect the growth of different plants in an area. So the greater the light availability, generally, the greater the success of plant survivals. We do have certain scenarios where plants have actually evolved to live in low light intensities, and the way they've generally done that is they've got much bigger leaves, because a larger leaf has a larger surface area, which means more light will be absorbed in those lower light intensities. In order to actually measure the amount of light present, we just use a light meter. Next one is the temperature. The key way that temperature will affect living things is based on its influence on enzyme reactions. Hopefully from B1 we do remember that enzymes have that very distinctive graph where it comes up and then it drops back down really quickly. Now, what we find is that if we've got warm temperatures, then generally that means metabolic reactions happen faster and therefore organisms will survive better and grow better. If we think about certain animals like lizards, for example, they are what we describe as an ectotherm, so they don't actually have internal body temperature control. They rely on all the heat coming from outside. So the first thing they do in the morning is they get up, they go and sit on a rock or some bit of concrete somewhere, and they just let the sun warm them up. That then gets their enzymes working faster, their metabolic reactions increase, and then away they go for the day. Third one is water. Bit of an obvious statement here, living things need water or they die. So again, what we can do here is investigate what happens with the water. Thinking back to B2, then we had a look to see osmosis and what happens there. And if plants have a lack of water, then they wilt first of all, and then what we find is they will die if they don't obviously get water. So in terms of measuring the water, we literally use a humidity sensor. For the temperature, hopefully the most obvious thing in the world, a thermometer. And if we wanted to measure the pH, then we'd use a pH probe, because again, the last factor we need to know is pH, and that's just the fact that different plants will grow in different soils. Some absolutely perfectly suited to acid soils, so things like rhododendrons will grow brilliantly in acidic soils, whereas others are much more suited to alkaline soils, so things like a cucumber. So knowing what soil pH will determine what plants can actually grow there. The next thing we come on to is the idea of competition and interdependence. This is just a fancy way of saying that in any given habitat, we've got organisms and they're pretty much going to fight it out for the different resources they need. That's pretty much what we're looking at here. In order to actually survive, plants and animals need certain things, okay? So they will obviously need things like water, they're going to need things like light, minerals, space. If they're plants, if we're talking animals, still water, but then they need food, breeding partners, territory, etc. So they've got different things that they need, but they will be competing with other plants and animals for those same materials. If we've obviously got an ample supply, then competition isn't such a key factor. If there's only a limited amount of one of those materials, competition is key, because what you'll find is there's not enough to go around for everyone, so some will get those materials and survive, others not so much, and death will occur. So what we actually find is that the weaker competitor is either going to die or they're going to have to move on and find it somewhere else. This will have a direct impact then on the population within any given area of a species. And when we talk about population, that's just the number of organisms of each species that live in an area. So that link between the competition and the population size is really important to understand. The second thing we talked about was interdependence. And this quite simply is going to be how different organisms depend on each other in a community. Now, we've got three types of relationship that we could see here: predation, mutualism, and parasitism. So predation is the predator and prey relationship, which brings us to the good old predator and prey graph. So if you remember, you might be asked to describe this or explain this graph here. And the key things we're looking at is the fact that when we get an increase in our prey population, then we get an increase in the predator population. Whereas when we get a decrease in the prey, we then get a decrease in the predators. But there's always that lag between them. So if they were to ask you a question, describe, say what you see. Literally, you can say that when the hare population increases, a short while later, the population of the actual lynxes increases. And then when the hare population decreases, the population of lynxes decreases a short time after. That's it. You don't need to explain it because it's describe, it's say what you see. If it's explain, that means you need to do that bit and then say why that happens. So the population of hares increases, and then the population of lynx increase a short while after, because there's plenty of food available for the lynx, therefore they can breed and survive better. You're just adding that extra bit of detail. The second one, mutualism. This is where both organisms are going to benefit. So that means both of the organisms involved in this relationship are getting something out of it. If we're talking about the third relationship, that's parasitism, and the key distinction here is that only the parasite will benefit. The host is going to suffer as a result of this relationship. So what we find, three relationships you need to be able to describe: predation, mutualism, Parasitism. In terms of what's going to be on your test tomorrow, it could be any of these things we're going through. I'm not going to tell you exactly what questions are on the test. That kind of eliminates the point of doing a test. But we are going to review all of B4, and everything that's on the test will be covered tonight. But there will also be a few things that may not be on the test paper too. Now, the next bit we come on to are the pyramids. Now, I know that from your little self-assessment forms you did for me, the pyramids were not the greatest. So the first one, the easy one, the pyramid of numbers, is as the name suggests. It's a pyramid made up of the numbers of organisms in each trophic level. So what we start off with is a bar that is as wide as the number of organisms. So we could end up with a couple of different versions. Let me just draw a couple of quick ones. So our pyramid of numbers could look like these. Now, what we've got on this side, we've obviously got lots of grass, so we've got the longest bar, slightly fewer snails, and even fewer hedgehogs. So all we've done, the length of the bar there represents the number of the organisms. The key thing about pyramids of numbers, they're not always pyramid shaped, as we can see with this one, because we could start off with a single oak tree, which then has thousands of insects living on it, a slightly smaller number of little birds, and then a far smaller number of larger birds. So the width of the bar is the number of organisms in a pyramid of numbers. The pyramid of biomass, however, is slightly different in the fact that the width of the bar is the total amount of biomass. So these will always be pyramid shaped. There is no one that is not pyramid shaped when it's a pyramid of biomass. Because not only does it take the population into account, but it also takes the size of the organism into account. So the bottom bar will always be the longest. When you're asked to draw a pyramid of biomass or a pyramid of numbers on your exam paper, then what you need to do is use a scale. They will give you a piece of printed graph paper, so you don't have to use a ruler and measure it. It's literally look at the sort of width of the bit of graph paper, look at the numbers you're given, and then apply a scale to it. The bottom is always your producer, so that's always your bottom bar, and then you just build up to actually make it so that each trophic level then builds further and further up. So all you do is you then just stack them up using the same scale each time, and the last thing to do is just label the bars. So you just write on there oak tree, rabbit, whatever it may be on the right bar. And that's it. It's nothing too taxing. You don't have to panic about it. Now, when we're looking at biomass, they could ask you, how do we calculate this biomass? And quite simply, all we do is we take a sample from each trophic level. We then calculate the average mass of those sampled organisms, and we can then multiply that by the population size. That's our total biomass then. Now, what we tend to do is use something called the dry mass of an organism. And as I mentioned earlier, that's where we've pretty much dried them out. So the downside to this, if we dry out an organism, it's dead. So we don't want to do this with super rare creatures for hopefully very obvious reasons. But dry mass, work it out, and then we can multiply it by the population size. We've got the total biomass there. We did mention earlier on that not all of the energy is actually transferred from one trophic level to the next in our food chains. Now, the reason for this is that we've got a range of different ways that energy is lost. So the first one is when we're thinking about plants being eaten, not every bit of the plant gets eaten. It's not like when a rabbit is eating a patch of dandelions that they then sit there, dig up every bit of the root and make sure they get every last scrap of it. So some of it won't be eaten. Just like other animals, they don't tend to eat the bones. They'll eat the flesh, but bones, don't bother, leave them behind. So that's our first way we're actually losing some of that biomass. Second is in the process of respiration. So in order to actually carry out all of these different biological processes, we need energy in the form of ATP, and this comes from the process of respiration. Third one is egestion. Now that's just where all the undigested material is lost from the body as feces. And the last one is excretion, which is where the waste products are lost from the body in things like urine. So not everything is eaten: respiration, egestion, excretion. Usually they'd ask you for potentially 2 examples of how energy or biomass is lost from a food chain. So if you know the 4, you've got a couple of spares in the bag as well. What we do find is that as a result of this loss of energy and biomass at each level of our food chain, then we've got to limit how long the food chain can be. And usually it's 4 trophic levels long. Because when we try to go beyond that 4th trophic level, then there's just not sufficient actual energy left to support life there. The maths component here could be a calculation on the efficiency of the biomass transfer. Now, efficiency calculations are pretty much the same whether we're looking at them in biology or physics. Efficiency is efficiency at the end of the day. So what you're looking at is the biomass or the energy available after divided by the biomass or the energy available before, and then we multiply it by 100 because we do it as a percentage. So in the case of our pyramids of biomass and the biomass transfer, it would be your biomass available after the transfer, which would be in grams or kilograms. You divide that then by the biomass available before the transfer happened, and then multiply it by 100. That will give you a number between 0 and 100. If it doesn't, you've calculated it wrong. Go back, because we will not have more than 100% of our biomass being transferred for hopefully very obvious reasons there. So that's a quick check you can do for that one. The next part of B4 are the cycles that we looked at. And hopefully we remember that there are 3 key cycles we need to know for this topic. So the first one is the carbon cycle. And carbon is really important in living things because we use it to make fats, proteins, carbohydrates, pretty much name a biological molecule, we need carbon for it. Second is the nitrogen cycle, which we use to make DNA and our proteins. And the third is the water cycle. Now, we obviously had a little look at the nitrogen cycle in class the other day, so we're only going to have a quick review on it. Here is our lovely diagram again. So we start off with nitrogen in the air. This is nitrogen gas, N2. Plants can't actually take nitrogen gas in directly. They need to rely on bacteria to convert it into nitrates. So what we find is our nitrogen fixing bacteria turn the nitrogen gas into nitrates, which are then absorbed by the roots of the plant. Once the nitrates have been absorbed by the roots of the plant will use them to change into proteins, and that becomes part of the biomass of the tree. From there, we can have the plants eaten by animals, and that means the proteins from the plants are passed on to the animals and becomes animal protein. Both plants and animals can die and go through the process of decomposition carried out by bacteria and fungi, where the proteins are broken down into ammonia. So decomposers then convert proteins to ammonia. We can also have the animals carrying out excretion, and again that will contribute ammonia to our soil too. Once we've got the ammonia, then what we've got are nitrifying bacteria that change the ammonia into nitrates, which can again be absorbed by our plants. So that is our nitrogen cycle. And if you remember, what we've actually got are 4 of these important types of microbe. So the first one are the decomposers, the bacteria and the fungi. They convert the proteins into ammonia. Second, the nitrifying bacteria turn the ammonia into nitrates. Third, the nitrogen fixing bacteria turn nitrogen into nitrates. And then the denitrifying bacteria turn the nitrates into nitrogen. Even if they were to give you a 6-mark question on the nitrogen cycle, if you know the 4 types of bacteria and what they do, you're pretty much there, I'll be honest. You can add a little bit about the plants being eaten by the animals just to top it up to the end, but that's about it. Those 4 types of bacteria are the key bit. Second cycle is the water cycle. So here we go, this is our lovely water cycle diagram, should be familiar from a range of different bits over your school career, I hope. Now, what we've got are a few key processes here. If we start off, let's start in the ocean this time. So the first thing that happens is water in oceans, lakes, rivers, puddles, anything that's sitting water on the ground, that's going to evaporate and therefore rise as water vapour. Once that happens, the water vapour is going to go further into the atmosphere. The further up it goes, the cooler it gets. So we then have condensation, which changes it into basically clouds at the end of the day. Those clouds will continue to rise and cool, and eventually it's going to fall as precipitation. So precipitation is just the flashy word for it rains. Once that happens, the water comes down to the surface. Some of it is going to trickle through those little gaps in the soil and the rocks in a process called percolation. And some of it will actually just run down into lakes and rivers just as surface runoff. We'll find our plants take up the water through their roots again. And then plants will carry out the process of transpiration, which is the loss of water vapour from the aerial parts of the plant, which again feeds the water vapour back into the atmosphere through the condensation and so on. So we need to know those key processes for the water cycle. So condensation, it's going to change into the clouds. Precipitation falls as rain. Percolation trickles through the rocks and the soil. Then we've got transpiration, loss of water vapour from the plant, and evaporation is when it's going to literally change from liquid water into water vapour. The third cycle is the carbon cycle then, folks. So what we've got here is our lovely simplified diagram of the carbon cycle, and we'll kick off with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere again. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has one process only that will remove it, which is photosynthesis. So hopefully remember, photosynthesis is carbon dioxide plus water makes glucose and oxygen. So we remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis, and then obviously it becomes incorporated into our plants. Once more, the plants can be eaten by animals, and both plants and animals can die, and we get the process of decomposition happening again. As a result of the respiration of the decomposers, the animals and the plants, we have carbon dioxide released back into the atmosphere. Sometimes when things die, they don't just break down instantly. They can end up over millions of years being changed into fossil fuels. And then when we dig those fossil fuels out of the ground and we burn them in that combustion process, again, carbon dioxide comes back into the atmosphere. So what we've got there are three key processes that release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere: respiration, decomposition, combustion, and one process that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere: photosynthesis. What we do need to bear in mind though is that even though we do have carbon dioxide levels which are generally on that upward trend, it does vary slightly. So it's not a lovely smooth line that we see if we look at a graph of it. What it ends up with is this little zigzaggy appearance. Because what we have is during the day we will have both respiration and photosynthesis happening. But at night we can only have respiration taking place. So that means that overnight we're releasing carbon dioxide but not removing it, because no photosynthesis can happen if there's no sunlight. So what we see is it goes up a little bit at night and then comes down a little bit during the day when photosynthesis goes on. But generally the trend is upward, all down to us as humans again, with all of our wonderful activities of burning fossil fuels left, right and centre. The last bit that we need to know for B4 is all about decomposers and the detritivores. When we're talking about decomposers, and we've mentioned these already in our cycles, these are bacteria and fungi. So if they ask you to name a decomposer, then bacteria or fungi. That's it. What they do is they're going to break down anything that's dead and also the urine and the feces, and they're going to then obviously change that organic material into the minerals which end up back in the soil. We actually refer to these decomposers as a type of organism called a saprophyte. Now, saprophytes actually feed in a special way. What they do is they secrete enzymes, so they release the enzymes from inside themselves onto the dead material. The enzymes then break it down, and then they just absorb the nutrients at the end. The second type are detritivores. Now, detritivores are small animals that speed up decomposition by breaking the organic material into really small pieces. So these are things like worms and woodlice. What they do is they come along, they eat some of the organic material, poop it out the other end, and as it's gone through their digestive system, then they basically got a larger surface area for the decomposers to work on. The only other thing they could ask you is relating decomposition to an experiment. Sometimes they talk about compost heaps here, other times they actually use a proper experiment that you could do in a lab. But the key thing is they're looking at the factors that will affect the rate of decomposition. So we can increase the rate of decomposition if temperatures are warm, it's moist, and there's plenty of oxygen. So if they give you a question saying, how could we increase the rate of decomposition of a compost heap, keep it warm, make sure there's water added to it, and turn it over so that we actually have plenty of oxygen there. I don't know why there's an echo. I haven't changed any of the settings. Hopefully it will stop. The very last thing is they could ask us to calculate the rate of decay, which quite simply is your change in mass divided by time. Just like any kind of rate, changing something divided by the time that takes. That's it. That's all there is at B4. So, if you have any questions, ask them now, and I will see if I can go through anything you don't understand. But other than that, we have covered all of the content that could come up on that exam. So, I'll give you a couple of minutes just to see if anyone's got any questions on it. Otherwise, my suggestion to you is that before tomorrow, make sure you've gone over any of those bits you're not 100% certain on. The cycles particularly, the pyramids of biomass, because those were the bits that in your self-reviews you were a little bit shakier on. And then just make sure that when you actually come in tomorrow, that you do so with a calculator and obviously all the rest of your equipment, so your pen and so on. The tests won't be bad, I promise, I've written them, they are fine, you can all access these papers. So, just give you a little moment, see if there's any questions. Alright then folks, obviously don't stay up too late doing any revision, and I look forward to obviously seeing you tomorrow. We do have 2 biology lessons tomorrow. The first one, we are going to have a chance to do revision. So if you want to bring in any of your own notes, revision cards, anything like that, by all means feel free. So first lesson is going to be revision, second lesson, test time. Make sure you get a good night's sleep, and I will see you all in the morning.